How's it going, everyone? It's Avi from Weather Sponge 1000, and in this video, we're of course going to focus on this next tropical disturbance that's expected to move into the Caribbean into next week and determine if this will develop into Tropical Storm Bonnie and potentially impact the United States in the very long-term future. But before I begin, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather-related content. Make sure to like if you like this video, and make sure to turn on post notifications if you want to see even more weather-related content. So let's begin by taking a look at the GFS model, and we haven't had any sort of major differences with the forecast, but the GFS model is still persisting that this tropical disturbance that's expected to move into the Caribbean will develop into Tropical Storm Bonnie, at least right around Central America. This is as of the latest 12Z run of today, and you see that we've been focusing on this plume of moisture that's expected to move into the Caribbean that could induce enough convection to where a low-level center will form and develop into Tropical Storm Bonnie. So if we were to take a look right now, you see that the air is mainly stable throughout the Caribbean as well as the Gulf of Mexico. There is quite a bit of dry air, and there really isn't an area where there's a lot of convection going on, but that will change into next week because we will of course see a plume of moisture, and we could see a low-level center develop out of this gyre right around Central America, which is typical for the early months of the hurricane season, especially towards June, where we do see a lot of tropical cyclones originate from a gyre over the Central American region, which does bring a lot of rain to a lot of the Central American countries, which is part of the reason why, although we're technically in the summer months in the Northern Hemisphere, it's technically winter right around Central America because it rains so much. And this could be one of those cases where we could see a tropical cyclone develop out of this gyre, and that's what the GFS model has been persistent on over the past several runs, and it really hasn't changed its tune when it comes to developing a tropical storm. So we could see this low pressure system develop as early as the 6-day mark, which would be around Tuesday, June 14th. And if we were to continue to move forward after that, the GFS model does expect it to strengthen. However, what's interesting is that compared to yesterday's run, the GFS model now wants to take a track further closer to Central America, which definitely would be more of a concern for a lot of these Central American countries, because that could create a heavy rain threat and flood threat if this were to come close to the Central American coast. But that might be good news generally speaking, because if this were to move further closer to land, then it's less likely that we're going to see a gradual intensifying process with this low pressure system, since there's so much land interaction, and that will increase the friction that this storm has to deal with, which would decrease the wind speed and the amount of rotation around center circulation. And of course, there's going to be less convection if this low pressure system deals with more land. So that would definitely be good news. But the GFS model, despite this, is mainly keeping the low pressure system just enough offshore to where it's still developing as it moves northward. But it's definitely different from yesterday's run, because yesterday's run, the GFS model wanted to take a much stronger storm, but now the GFS model has definitely lowered its intensifying by how fast it intensifies as it moves northwestward, as it's pretty much staying as a weak tropical storm in this run, which I do think is the more likely scenario, because yesterday's run of the GFS model seemed a little bit too strong to be really true for a tropical cyclone this during the early part of the hurricane season, because of course during the early part of the hurricane season, like the month of June, there's a lot of wind shear, there's still quite a bit of dry air, so it's unlikely that we will see strengthen a very rapidly intensifying low pressure system move all the way northeastward without being deterred by strong wind shear or dry air. But the GFS model has now taken a more realistic approach with this tropical cyclone. But what's interesting is that this storm is going to move very slowly, so we're likely going to talk about this storm for quite a while, because look how slowly it moves. It develops just off I'd say Costa Rica by right around the 150-hour mark. But if we were to move 90 hours out, which is a 4-day period, this barely moves at all, pretty much only staying in the moving around 100 miles, which could be key, because if this does stay over the same area for a while, that could create an upwelling that would bring cooler waters, which would inhibit the storm strengthening as well. But we need to wait and see how fast this moves. Really, there's very slow steering currents. There isn't really a strong steering current that's trying to move it further northwestward. So we're going to see this move slowly. So Central America needs to pay attention to heavy rainfall. But the GFS model is still persistent on developing this. Compare this to the European model. The European model still isn't forecasting anything to develop out of this. This is as of the 0Z run. So while the European model does expect more moisture to move into Central America, it isn't really developing anything really, as there's really no area where there's a low level center, which is definitely something to keep in mind. And that unfortunately raises uncertainty with this forecast when both of the computer models are disagreeing. But now that the fact that GFS model is leaning more towards the European model, taking a weaker low pressure system, that could mean that we might not see really anything develop, which would certainly be good news. But the GFS model, since it's been so persistent on developing a tropical storm, we can't disregard that possibility that a tropical storm develops either to right around the Caribbean and moves northwestward into the Gulf of Mexico. So definitely a lot to keep in mind. So let's first take a look at the relative humidity in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, where the pressure is between 700 and 300 millibars. So if I were to continue to move forward, like I said, we will see a plume of moisture move northward, and look at how much moisture there is, and not a lot of dry air, which would definitely help this storm develop. As you see that the dry air in terms of the GFS models scenario isn't really a problem. So but if we were to compare that to the European model, however, there's a lot less moisture, a lot more dry air, which will definitely inhibit this storm from developing. Taking a look at the same time period, while there is a small area of moisture, it isn't very humid enough for a high amount of convection to develop a low level center for a possibility of a tropical storm to develop under these conditions, as there's still quite a bit of dry air. And what the computer models won't show you is the amount of Saharan dust there is either, because there's expected to be an influx of Saharan dust to move into the Caribbean over the next week, and that certainly could inhibit its chances, because what Saharan dust does is that it creates a temperature inversion in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. Since the Saharan dust is warmer than the air mass that's along the sea surface, where it's holding a lot of that water vapor, that means that the air mass in the lower levels along the sea surface will sink rather than rise, because of course the cooler air mass sinks in the midst of a warmer air mass, and in this case the Saharan dust would be the warmer air mass that will force the water vapor and the warm air mass along the sea surface to sink, or the cooler air mass of the sea surface to sink, which would inhibit convection and inhibit any sort of upward motion occurring in the atmosphere for a tropical storm Bonnie to occur. So pretty much to summarize, at this point, it seems like the GFS model is more lenient on bringing a small tropical storm, but both computer models want to take an influx of moisture to the Caribbean, which could be our possibility that a tropical storm will develop. But at this point, it seems like it's going to be a little bit difficult based on the amount of Saharan dust that could move, but it's certainly a possibility that pretty much the Central American region and the Caribbean will need to pay close attention to, because there's still definitely a good possibility that a tropical storm could develop out of this plume of moisture. But so definitely at least be aware of it, but there's still a high amount of uncertainty, so make sure to stay tuned to the latest forecast regarding the hurricane season for the Caribbean. Now, to show you guys the amount of Saharan dust that's expected to move westward, you see that. Look at how much Saharan dust is moving into the Caribbean. That should inhibit the storm from developing as it moves northwestward. But again, if this storm were to develop, it will develop right around the Tuesday time frame. So there could be that possibility that the dust subsides, as we do see a little bit of an area where the Saharan dust doesn't really exists right around the Saturday time frame. So we could see maybe an open area where the Saharan dust isn't really an inhibiting factor, but we just need to wait and see. But this could definitely be an inhibiting factor when trying to develop Tropical Storm Bonnie in the by next week. Taking a look at the 5-day tropical weather outlook, we do see that no new tropical cyclones are expected during the next 5 days. But of course, that could change as we head closer and closer to the time frame where tropical storm could develop. Because if Tropical Storm Bonnie were to develop, it'll develop around the 6 to 7 day time frame, and of course, that goes beyond the 5-day threshold that's needed to be included in the 5-day graphical tropical weather outlook. So we could definitely see the National Hurricane Center change its possibility over the next several days once we get more certainty and closer to the forecast time frame when it comes to forecasting the possibility of tropical cyclones during the next 5 days. Now, taking a look at the MJO filtered forecasts, you see that for today, we're in the negative MJO pattern, which would promote more lift right around the Caribbean as well as the Gulf of Mexico. However, going into next week, we do see the negative MJO pattern subside, but still existing right around the southwestern portion of the Caribbean. So we still could see an area where there's going to be a little bit more lift than expected, which does enhance a chance of a tropical storm developing. But by week 2, we should see us go back to a positive phase, which could inhibit tropical cyclone development for not only the next couple of days, but for the next couple of weeks, especially if we do see the Saharan dust begin to dominate the Caribbean as well as the Gulf of Mexico. But with the MJO pattern in negative phase, that does somewhat raise the chance of a tropical cyclone developing right around southwestern Caribbean. Now, taking a look at my forecast when it comes to where exactly Tropical Storm Bonnie would develop if we do see it at this point, I'd still say the chances may be lower, but there's still a high amount of uncertainty that we could see. So we could still see Tropical Storm Bonnie. We just need to wait and see how the computer models change their forecast over the next several days before we can confidently say if it's a low chance, a high chance, or maybe a moderate chance. So make sure to stay tuned throughout the Caribbean as well as the Central American areas, and even as far north as the Gulf of Mexico, because if this were to develop, it will move straight to the northwest, and there's only so many areas it could impact without impacting the Gulf Coast states. So at least be aware of this and stay tuned to any updates regarding this tropical disturbance. But anyways, guys, I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather-related content. Make sure to like if you like this video, and make sure to turn on post notifications if you want to see even more weather-related content. And I hope you guys have a great day.